So this video looks at the neurotransmitter explanation for schizophrenia, which is an example of a biological explanation. You need to be able to describe and evaluate this explanation of schizophrenia, and you may even be asked to compare it to other explanations, whether that's biological or non-biological, or even for different disorders. Okay, so one biological explanation for schizophrenia is that it is related to neurotransmitter functioning. So research suggests that the presence of an excess number of dopamine receptors at the synapse contributes to schizophrenia. I really recommend that you go back and you watch some of the biological psychology videos before you look at this, and just remind yourself about receptors and the synapse and how messages are passed across. Now, it's possible that an increase in dopamine across the mesolimbic pathway in the brain contributes to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, and that an increase in dopamine at the mesocortical pathway contributes to the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. A really good way to remember this is think about a thumbs up. If you use your limb to give a thumb up, then it's indicating that it's a positive symptom. So really quickly, obviously we've got a presynaptic and a postsynaptic cell across the synapse here. You can see the little circles in here are vesicles carrying different aspects of neurotransmitter. So this is how the neurotransmitter is stored. Now you can see that once an action potential occurs, these vesicles move down to the bottom of the presynaptic cell and will be released across here, which is called the synaptic cleft or the synaptic gap. For example, if this was dopamine, you will see down here, these would be dopamine receptors. Now, it's interesting to remember that you can only bind a neurotransmitter on a receptor site that fits, but say you had a dopamine neurotransmitter across the synaptic cleft, then it would sit on a dopamine receptor, and it would therefore mean that it's absorbed by the postsynaptic cell. Now, neurotransmitters, we know, are brain cells which transmit and receive messages, and they communicate with each other through these neurotransmitters. Now, one of the theories about the causes of mental disorders is that there is an imbalance, so either an excess or a deficiency, which means not enough, of certain neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitter molecules are released from the end of the presynaptic cell into the synaptic gap that we've just talked about. And the relationship between the neurotransmitter molecule and the receptor site is like a lock and key, as we just mentioned. Once this process has happened, any excess molecules are then taken back up by the presynaptic cell and recycled in a process called reuptake. So the dopamine hypothesis is one of the oldest explanations for schizophrenia that's got a scientific and a biological basis, and it suggests that the brains of schizophrenic patients produces more dopamine than other people. However, it's now thought that schizophrenics have an abnormally high number of D2 receptors. Now, if you remember what we just talked about these receptors on the postsynaptic cell, so it therefore means that there's an increase of dopamine being absorbed into the postsynaptic cell, leading to an increase of dopamine. There are many ways in which such sensitivity to dopamine can arise, from genetic inheritance to brain lesioning. The conclusion seems to be that there are loads of different ways to develop schizophrenia, or at least ways in which supersensitivity to dopamine can occur. So lots of the research looks at excess dopamine receptors and how they arise, and a lot of it's been done on animals. Research that's been done on humans has looked at PET scans and other scanning methods. Now you can see on the pictures of the screen that you've got increased dopamine activity levels in a schizophrenic patient when you look at the sheer volume that's being covered across the brain. Now, when we look at the role of drugs in proving the dopamine hypothesis, amphetamines are agonists, which means that they increase dopamine levels. Now, large quantities of amphetamines, when taken as a recreational drug, can actually induce hallucinations and delusions into the person taking it. Now, if drugs are given to schizophrenic patients, then their symptoms get worse as well. Now, because amphetamines increase dopamine levels, the argument here is that this is proof that increased dopamine levels lead to delusions and hallucinations, which we know are positive type 1 symptoms of schizophrenia. On the other side of things, you have Parkinson's disease. Now, Parkinson's disease is often associated with low levels of dopamine, so in order to counteract that, doctors prescribe L-Dopa, which is a drug which works to increase dopamine activity levels across the synapse in order to be able to give Parkinson's sufferers a little bit more normal cognition. Now, people with Parkinson's, if they take too much L-Dopa, start to develop schizophrenic symptoms, particularly the positive type 1 symptoms that we've been talking about so far, so auditory hallucinations and delusions. Chlorpromazine is an antipsychotic drug which is given to schizophrenics. We discussed this more on the different video that looks at treatments. But chlorpromazine works by blocking specifically D2 receptors across the synapse. Now, by blocking the receptors, you reduce the amount of dopamine that's absorbed across the synaptic gap. Once a schizophrenic patient has had chlorpromazine, their positive symptoms dramatically reduce. All of this works together for evidence of the role of dopamine in schizophrenia. Other elements of evidence come from post-mortem studies. Seidman in 1990 showed that in a post-mortem study, which is an examination of the brain after death, has found that people with schizophrenia have much larger than usual numbers of dopamine receptors, again suggesting this idea that more dopamine has been absorbed at the synapse. PET scans are often used when assessing the causes of schizophrenia in humans. Research from 1987 suggests that there are more as twice as many dopamine receptors in schizophrenics compared to controls. So again, this is further evidence supporting the role of dopamine. And Fard et al. Said that there was no difference in the number of dopamine receptors between schizophrenics and control. So you have an opposing piece of evidence there suggesting that dopamine has no role to play. You need to be really careful with some of these arguments though, because we call them a circular argument, just the same as what came first, the chicken or the egg. Does dopamine or too much dopamine cause schizophrenia, or does schizophrenia itself cause too much dopamine? A lot of the issues that we've got with research is they've all been done on schizophrenics, rather than doing them on normal patients who later go on to develop schizophrenia, because ultimately we'll never know who to test. Unless you test everybody in the country, you would never be able to see who does and doesn't go on to develop schizophrenia. So, strengths for the dopamine hypothesis. Donnelly et al. In 1996 looked at homovanillic acid, which is actually a waste product of dopamine that's passed out of the body. And they found that those with schizophrenia have more of this type of acid in the body than without, suggesting that they do produce more dopamine. Drugs that increase dopamine production in sufferers from Parkinson's disease do give them psychotic symptoms. L-Dopa that we've just talked about, which is a drug used for Parkinson's disease, can make people experience symptoms similar to schizophrenia, suggesting that dopamine does relate to schizophrenic symptoms. There are genes linked with dopamine production that are found more commonly in those with schizophrenia. Genes that are likely to increase sensitivity to dopamine are found in those who develop symptoms of schizophrenia. So this again suggests that there is likely to be a genetic explanation for schizophrenia along with a dopamine explanation. When looking at weaknesses, PET scans show that blocking dopamine receptors do not always remove the symptoms. PET scans have suggested that drugs that block dopamine did not reduce the symptoms of schizophrenia in patients who've had the disorder for 10 years or more, even if the block was 90% effective. However, antipsychotic drugs are administered early on in the disorder for more than 90% of the patients that respond. Blocking dopamine receptors does take a few days to work. Now, antipsychotic drugs block dopamine receptors immediately. However, it takes several days for any claim in effect to be noticeable. This suggests that there is something other than dopamine that's responsible for causing psychotic symptoms. Otherwise, the effect would be immediate. It's really difficult to know if excess dopamine causes schizophrenia or if schizophrenia causes excess dopamine, as we just talked about. And there's a really strong argument that social and environmental factors are also involved. Now, they seem to trigger schizophrenia, so a biological explanation is not sufficient on its own. Perhaps a stressful life event can trigger the production of excess dopamine, which actually then would explain the higher levels of dopamine being produced.